We all have a tendency as pianists to think of staccato as up. We think of playing a staccato as coming up off the key. And that's not completely wrong, but it's impossible if we have to come this far off the key to play very quickly at all. In fact, if I tried to play the Presto section by coming off of the key for every single staccato to that degree, this is what it would look like. And you can see how silly that almost looks and how difficult that is. It was almost impossible for me to not make a mistake when I'm playing just because I'm not feeling where I'm at on the keyboard at all. Instead, I have to keep coming back and finding where I've been. And even though that was a little bit of an exaggeration, a lot of us still have that tendency. And I knew that I did, especially when I learned this piece as a kid, is that I would tend to want to keep coming off with my hands. And so instead, what is extremely important is to realize that we can play a staccato without actually leaving the key. So if I want to play this initial beat here in measure 28 and play the whole first half of that measure with the right hand, I do not have to do. Instead, I can be here. So notice my fingers are never actually leaving the key. It's more about the attack. But I'm keeping very close to the key and not even leaving the key. This element is what allows us to have the speed to play it like this. So by keeping close to the key, it allows for more accuracy, comfort, and it allows for a faster tempo. So how do we practice that? Well, it really just does take work. You can use something like a scale or a piece perhaps that you've played a lot and that you're very comfortable with and pretend that the whole piece is in staccato and work on never leaving the key as you do the staccato. And that will take some practice, but essentially what I want you to think of is having your wrist nice and loose. And it's almost like you're using a complete effort of doing this. Almost kind of like you're wanting to scrub the key a little bit, like if there's something on the key. That's a good way to at least get an idea of how to start. For every individual, you're going to have a different experience from how that feels. So for all of these Presto sections, one thing that I found helpful was to find places that, despite everything being staccato, and then after working on making sure I stay close to the key, is having a place of relaxation. Think about video games, for example. As you're playing a video game, if you know that there's no safety checkpoints and that you either have to restart the game from scratch or you can complete the game and there's no in between, it creates a lot of anxiety and pressure for yourself the farther you go in the video game, because you know that if you are almost at the end, that you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Whereas if you have the idea of a checkpoint, meaning, well, you already passed a specific level, so you don't have to start at the very beginning. You can go to this next level instead and just work from there. It's a little bit more soothing. And it's the same with piano when we're performing. It's nice to have areas to just kind of relax and check in with yourself physically so that you don't feel like you either are going to make it to the end or you won't. And so the way that I found that in this Presto section is I found that every second eighth note within the groups of 3 in the half bars was kind of my safety point. So here's an exaggeration of it. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm relaxing my arms and I'm checking in and I'm redropping my arm weight every time after I do one of these small groups. So let me demonstrate it again, and you'll see that after I'm kind of putting a little bit of extra weight at the end of each one of these mini groups, I'm redropping my arms, almost like if you want to experience it, it's like dropping your arms on your lap like this. I find that that's the most comfortable way for me to do these scherzando passages, so that when I go back and I increase the speed, you may not hear those actual mini groups, but you can see that my hand has a safety point to check in. So that's always a wise thing to do, is to try to find where your hand feels most relaxed and you feel the ability to drop your weight most comfortably within any fast section, especially after you've already trained yourself to not leave the key or to have tension in your arm. So the next passage that many students struggle with right when they begin is at measure 44. So measure 44, we have this sense of the repeating thirds that are going very, very, very quickly. So as we're playing, it's this passage. So thirds can often be daunting, even though at the end of learning this piece, it should be the most fun, easy thing for you to play. So here's my suggestion for how to work on learning oscillating thirds. So for me, I am never a fan of using 4 and 3 on the section. I can do it, but it's just not comfortable for me. So again, know your strengths with your fingerings and as a pianist. For me, I like using 1-5 and 2-4. It works great for my smaller hand. A great thing to do is to leave notes out and always practice with leaving notes out. So what I'm going to begin by doing is on my first third, I'm going to leave off the G. So I'm just going to trill with the B and then the third that comes right after it. And what I'm doing is, again, trying not to leave the key or lift my fingers. I'm trying to just get used to balancing between those two notes and finding a nice balance wherever that may be in my hand. Then maybe I'll leave out the B and I'll focus on the G instead. So I'm noticing what changes in terms of the weight shift in my hand, where I might be feeling I'm most comfortable. Then of course I'll do the same thing with the following third. So then I'll play the first third and only play the top note, and the same thing, only the bottom note. In fact, a lot of pianists, when they go to play some of the extremely taxing concerti, if they get to thirds that are a little bit taxing for them at a point in a piece, sometimes it's very easy to create little shortcuts and cheat. It's very hard to hear the difference in a full long piece between the actual representation of the thirds and leaving out, let's say, the A. So it's a great little cheat if you're still struggling with it learning and you have a deadline. But the more that you practice all those different variations of balance, that can really, really, really help. Also, instead of starting from the top, you might find that the trill is easier if you start from the bottom. So pretending that it's starting down there. All of those things can help you access your own hand. And that's essentially what all of these different practice techniques are meant for with these thirds. Is no one can ever exactly tell you how to play oscillating thirds. It's more about you finding the balance in your hand that works best, which will determine the fingering that you use, and it'll determine which part of the trill you focus on, whether the upper notes are more comfortable for you, the lower notes, or if maybe you find that your distance between your thumb and your second finger is easier. But find what your strengths are and work off of there. So now let's talk about another very long, difficult passage work. So at measure 156, we have, again, these wonderful arpeggios, which we might classify as, again, more of our easy material, preceding it right there in 154. So in 154, we can, again, bring out the top and have it do that sparkle. So it sounds a little bit flashier than maybe it actually is difficult for us to play. However, the next following section, if we don't know how to regroup it or simplify it, can get very difficult and almost be like a finger twister for us. So with all of this, what we would call chromaticism, so we aren't just sticking with one chord to arpeggiate, instead we're adding in a lot of really spicy fun notes. How do we simplify that to make it easy for us? Well, the answer is actually in that he has a recurring pattern. So instead of thinking about each individual measure, even though musically that's what we might be inclined to do, instead, if we think about where the pattern repeats itself in the right hand, that's a form of regrouping. So as I look at the beginning of 156, I notice that he has two notes sort of close together, a high note and a low note, And then all of a sudden the pattern repeats. 2 notes close together, high note, low note. And then the pattern repeats on 157. So it's every group of 4 notes. And in thinking in that way, it really simplifies the entire passage for us. So instead of having to memorize this as a unit, we're memorizing this, and this, and this. And what's great is that we can practice it that way. And by practicing that, by regrouping what we see on the page, it allows us to remember when to drop our arm. So instead of thinking about dropping our arm here and then just hoping we get to the end, it reminds us to go like this. And then that way, when we put it with the left hand, even though we aren't necessarily going to bring that out in the end, as a first run, we would do the similar thing. So notice my left hand didn't necessarily play the exact right rhythm. It was just getting used to that idea of playing the chord. Now, let's say we go back and we try to do it with the idea that we can always keep dropping with our right hand. Now it has a lot more comfort. So again, it's very similar to the finger twister that we talked about earlier. And finally, for difficult sections, the thing that most of my students ask is how to play the flashy octaves at the end. Octaves are always the thing that we want to really bring out in the piece, especially when we have a flashy ending like this. So I wanted to give you some of my best practice advice for octaves. So the first thing that I would recommend, especially in octave passages such as this one, where both hands are playing the same notes, just alternating when they're playing, is to start by always playing them together. I find that octaves are easiest when we actually play things together because we have complete balance between both of our hands. So instead of playing it as written, I'm going to be playing this. And as I'm playing the octaves together, the biggest thing that I've used for all students as they learn how to play octaves is that I want them to be relaxed and I want them to also have a sense of what it's like to transition from octave to octave. One of my teachers gave me the best image in the world, which I still use to this day, which is the idea of a dead squid. And that may sound ridiculous, but I swear it works. So the idea is that if your hand is actually a dead squid, all you're doing is you're dropping the dead squid to go splat on the keys. So it's not a terrible idea to just do that for a little bit and get used to that feeling of that you have zero control over your fingers when you drop. Then as you go to play octaves, the idea is not to prepare. And that's always where we get caught as pianists, is we want to prepare. So we want to have the position and then play. But you actually have to get used to just completely dropping your hand with no expectation, like a dead squid, right onto the note. And then after you get used to that, it's about how to use that to go from one to the other. So notice I'm doing a dead squid here. The squid comes up to its natural state, and then it splats again on the next note. And so this may take actually a week or so of practicing very, very specifically to get comfortable. Even though it seems like a simple technique, it's really not, because it's essentially free falling onto the octave. But if you can achieve this, it gives you an absolute ease with octaves, zero tension. You could play octaves for hours and not have any issues with injury. You will also increase your speed and accuracy with octaves. So the first thing to do is to go through, make sure you have the notes memorized, the pattern memorized, to work on making sure that you're really doing the idea of the dead squid on every single octave. Then the idea is to, again, begin to know your own hand. Now, with most of us, when you think about how you will typically move your hand on a given day, whether it's writing or picking something up, we tend to do this motion, right? I'm just taking my hand from my lap and I'm going to pick something up, I do this motion. Or if I'm trying to scoop something up, I'll typically go this way. We rarely do this with our hands when we do everyday tasks. So I want you to always just kind of think of this motion of almost stirring the pot, scooping something up. And that's the first motion that I would recommend that you try to use for octaves. So as I'm playing octaves now, again, I'm still not completely playing it as written, but instead I'm now going, I'm playing left, right, and then out. So the idea is that I'm practicing scooping here and scooping here. And the reason I'm doing thumb, thumb out is that it's coordinating my thumbs to feel next to each other. It is okay, and I still do recommend once in a while for students to practice like this, bottom to top, or top to bottom. But the reason I don't recommend that as a first and final resort is that if you notice, I'm actually holding on to notes, I'm creating tension, I'm not keeping this natural movement. And octaves are all about natural movement. So here we go. So I'm starting now, I'm going left, right, out. And it doesn't have to be in a specific rhythm. It's just really making sure that I feel very, very confident and balanced on all of those notes. And the reason that I'm having left hand go first is it is going to have to lead everything. So I want to make sure especially that with my left hand thumb, I'm having this motion. And notice, again, I'm still trying to scoop inwards. So it's almost as though I'm trying to scoop the ice cream towards this part of my hand. And so why is that helpful? Because now that I'm used to the balance of both hands together, I'm going to pretend in my head that both hands are playing together, even though I'm not going to do that. So here's a little bit of an example. I'm going to just ever so slightly start to separate my hands. And so what you notice now is that my right hand, because it's used to playing with my left hand, is over every octave it needs to be at early, which is going to help facilitate speed. So now we've already gotten rid of all of the tension in my hand. I've already now gotten used to the notes, the patterns. So now when I go to play it more normally, all I'm really thinking about is adding just a tiny bit of space in between my two hands, and also just barely now connecting my hands more. So now you'll see again, I have complete relaxation in my hands as I'm doing it. It also allows me to take more time because I am relaxed. I don't feel like I have to play a note right when I get there.